Joining us now, Rear Admiral John Kirby, the coordinator for strategic communications at the National Security Council. Welcome back to Fox News Sunday, Admiral.
Thank you, Shannon. Good to be with you this morning.
Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, you had a conversation with my colleague Martha McCallum. It was in the context of Apple and what it's doing in China. You said this: we aren't in the business of telling private companies how to execute their initiatives. But it appears from these revelations from inside of Twitter, there were regular meetings between executives there, the FBI, DHS, the DNI. Flagging tweets, expressing their concerns, it seems trying to drive certain conversations. So should or shouldn't the federal government, federal agencies, in your words, be directing private companies on how to execute their initiatives?
We aren't directing private social media companies on how to manage their content. These are decisions that they have to make as appropriate. Now, look, we obviously don't want to see the public square polluted with hate speech and disinformation. That's not a good use of the information environment for the American people. But it's up to these social media companies to determine how they're going to manage their content, how they are going to deliver that content to their users.
But how much pushback ability do they have if the federal government, an agency like the FBI, is calling them up and saying, we don't like these specific tweets and think you should take action, and then they do, it appears?
Well, without speaking to that hypothetical situation, again, these are private companies, and they have to make these decisions based on their own policies, their own initiatives, and we respect that.
Okay, let's talk about the big news this week between Viktor Bout, the illegal arms merchant who was convicted of a number of things, was on a sentence here in the U.S., and he was traded for Brittney Griner. I think all Americans celebrate and have great relief that she is home, but there are questions about exactly what went down there. NBC initially had reporting that said the White House was given a choice between Paul Whelan, a U.S. Marine who's being held on espionage charges by Russia, and Brittney Griner, or no one. They said it was a misstatement. They corrected it later to say that it was either Brittney Griner or no one. Can you unequivocally say that there was never an option between Paul Whelan or Brittney Griner?
Yes, ma'am, I can. There was never a choice posed by the Russians, well, hey, you give us Bout back, and then you can decide whether you want Brittney or Paul. That was never the arrangement. It was only Miss Griner for Mr. Bout. They treat Paul differently, Shannon, because of these sham espionage charges. He is put in a special category by the Russians, and try as we might, and believe me, Shannon, we did. Right up until the very end, we were making efforts to try to get both of them out. There was just no way to get there. So it was either make this deal now and at least get one of them home and keep up the efforts to get Paul home, and that's where we are right now.
I want to ask about Mark Fogle because he's a U.S. teacher. He's taught in Russia for, I think, more than a decade, roughly a decade or so. He was taken into custody in August of last year, also coming through an airport there, had medical marijuana with him that was prescribed by a doctor because of injuries and surgeries that he's been through. He's been sentenced to 14 years. He obviously doesn't have the name recognition or the celebrity of a Brittney Griner, but he's been held on similar charges for longer than she has. Why wasn't he part of this conversation or this deal?
There's a limit in this particular case about what I can say publicly. I can tell you we're obviously mindful of this, of course, but there are some constraints here in terms of what we can say publicly. I can just broadly say that when it comes to wrongful detentions of Americans around the world, overseas, whether it's Russia or anywhere else, we're going to work as hard as we can to get them home.
Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat, had this to say. He chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Russians and other regimes that take American citizens hostage cannot pretend that there is equivalence between the Brittney Griners of the world and people like Viktor Bout, the so-called merchant of death. Nothing could be further from the truth, and we cannot ignore that releasing Bout back into the world is a deeply disturbing decision. Reaction out there from one of the former DEA regional directors who was part of putting him away found it astounding that he would be released. What kind of message does this send to our enemies, to bad actors out there who think if they've got an American, especially with any level of celebrity, they could get someone back like the, quote, merchant of death?
Sadly, this is a common tactic by Mr. Putin. We've seen this before. That's why the president has put in place additional accountability measures, visa restrictions, other sanctions that give us a little bit more influence and ability to affect the decision-making of potential hostage takers. We've also included on the State Department website for every country you want to visit, there's now a new designation which will let you know what the detention risk is if you want to travel to a certain country, whether it's for business or pleasure. So we urge Americans, if you're going to travel overseas, go look at that so you go fully informed. But know this, that even if you do everything right, and even if hostage takers are not dissuaded, that the United States government is going to do everything we can, if you're wrongfully detained overseas, to get you back home. And that might mean making some tough decisions, like the one the president just made. But in the end, the president believed it was the right thing to do to get to Brittney Griner back home. And of course, there's no equivalence. She wasn't guilty of anything. It was a sham trial to begin with. Mr. Bout obviously was guilty on very serious charges.
Well, including charges that he would sell to terrorists and other people that would freely go around and happily kill Americans. So you can imagine there's great deal of worry about him being released back out into the mainstream. We've seen what's happened with some of the people we've traded in deals that have ended up back on the battlefront and in places of, leadership in terrorism organizations. Over on the House side, Guy Reschenthaler, the Republican, and the House says this: Biden and Secretary Blinken better preserve their documents because the new House majority, Republican majority, is going to demand answers on this latest disaster. So how will this administration answer the questions about why Mark Fogle and Paul Whelan were left behind?
We will, of course, cooperate fully with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. If there's a need and a desire for more information, we'll be as forthcoming as we absolutely can be. Of course, we respect the role of Congress. A couple of points. Mr. Bout wasn't serving a life sentence, Shannon. He was going to get out in 2029. So at some point in the not-too-distant future, he would have been a free man. It is 6 years earlier. Nobody over at the White House is doing backflips of joy that he is walking the streets, but this was the deal we could get. Now was the moment we could get it. We're obviously going to look after our national security going forward, and Mr. Bout has choices to make. And if he chooses to get back into that line of work, then we're going to do everything we can to hold him properly accountable, as we have in the past. We did a national security assessment. We believe that that whatever risk there is was manageable and okay to make this deal.
All right. Well, the world will be watching. Admiral, thank you very much for your time. Always good to see you.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.